if you're going to say you care and listen and then you don't actually act on it, or you do what people don't want to do, then you can't be surprised when they leave or stop
Everyone
caring.
always acts surprised. And I was like, I wish people, like, if you're going to just do it anyways, just do it. Just own it. I would respect, like, things so much more if they're just like, we're just going to do it and just not care. It was like, great, but don't be surprised when people choose to leave or go on to something more aligned. So
your business's success depends on relationships with customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Karl Pontau. Each week, I'll bring you stories, insights, and practical advice from experts that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week, I'm excited to connect with Andie Washington. Andie is a community and culture strategist with a background in curating experiences and fostering connections towards self-fulfillment and community belonging. Her experience, expertise, and type A chill personality add structure to chaos in building and sustaining a more inclusive, equitable, and resilient future. Congrats on adding structure to chaos, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I needed to just do my intro everywhere. I love it.
Thank you. So one thing we talked about before starting recording is the idea of cultural debt and how that impacts the bottom line for businesses. Tell me more about cultural debt.
Yeah, so when you think about cultural debt, I know everyone, when you think about debt, you think usually like finances, or those in tech world, they think of like technical debt of just like, okay, how do we have these things and what is the debt going against it? But when you think of cultural debt, your cultural debt really is when you have those mission and values of a company of like, this is our vision, this is who we want to be and really want to have. We have that baseline. Debt is just every action you have not really aligning with those things. So I think just with everything going on of just fostering, like, yeah, we're about authenticity, we're about connection, we're about all those things that are your values, but your actions are not aligned with that. That deficit is cultural debt.
And so how does that impact the effectiveness of companies to grow?
Oh, well, you need people to have things work. So if you really don't have those things, like, that connection and really having the communication, you really can't grow or really sustain a company. Also, I really think when you avoid cultural debt, two main issues really come up is really two things. Psychological safety is a really big issue, and also commitment to misunderstanding. So when you think of people all together, because, we're not monoliths, we're not all the same brains, and we're saying, okay, we all have these values, we all have this mission, we're all on the same page, but yet if you don't have that really structure and infrastructure to really set things up so people can truly feel comfortable and grow, it really is a deficit. It really hinders a company.
Yeah, and imagine if people don't feel safe and they're worrying about all these other things. They're not focused on doing good work. They're not feeling like they're able to be as innovative, and it ends up hurting their productivity and the profitability of a company, because the people you bring on aren't doing as good of work, and also they're probably not going to stay as long, and so the cost of employee churn, I think, kills so many companies' growth, because they're spending so much money replacing people that they could keep if they just treated them better and had a better culture.
Yeah, some people focus so much with everything you're saying of like, okay, we have to focus on hiring, we have to focus on this, we have to focus on that, instead of actually just doing the work that brought them there and that got them excited. So it really is a missed opportunity.
And so what are some examples of times you've helped companies address their cultural debt and fix it, and what were some of the results of that?
Well, I will say I'm just one person. I'm gonna just be honest and realistic. I'm like, I can't fix it all, but I can definitely create systems, processes to really empower people, because it takes a team, it takes a village, no matter their levels or their involvement, whether they're an IC or a manager or even the leader of the company itself. I've worked with leaders specifically. They had a newish team, and they were going through a lot of miscommunications and understandings. So I specifically work with them around training and just kind of establishing like a consistency. So everyone has their own nuances, and I always say their opinions on how a job should be, and understanding flexibility, but there should at least be a baseline of training so people can always kind of go back and be like, okay, this is our standard of how we do things. Of course, people add their personalities or things like that, but if everyone has a basic line of understanding of training of how to do things, that just kind of specifically helps with kind of the customer service, all those things. I'm speaking specifically with hospitality with this example of I worked with this team of like training and onboarding, because when people walk through a door, they expect a certain level of service. And so when leaders are like, okay, we want this vision, we want to do these things, it's how we see it, kind of translating it down to how you onboard someone, how you train someone helps encourage those things.
And it sounds like this, it comes down to setting clear expectations for what people's job requirements are, or job like responsibilities are, and what's expected of them, and then holding people accountable to it. And then I remember seeing an article you posted about kind of what companies that have low cultural debt do right and ones that have high cultural debt do wrong. And it really comes down to a lot of the communication and leadership being open and setting clear expectations and making people know what they need to do to feel appreciated and do a good job, and what is expected of them. And that simple, it seems so basic, people go, well, duh, but it's often it's one of the things that's it's so simple, people overlook it, and then they just assume people would do things the way that you imagine they'll do it, but that's just not how people are. So different, they have different experiences, they're going to bring their own way of doing things. And so if you don't communicate clearly from the get-go, from the onboarding, it sounds like that just compounds to tons of issues and friction and conflict that, if you're not communicating well, turns quickly into a toxic environment.
Yes, I agree. And not only in onboarding, like throughout the just employee life cycle, it can happen. I think when it comes to, I'm really big on feedback, and I'm also into being proactive instead of reactive. So just kind of, instead of just kind of having things in place, but also being flexible. Having like, yes, you can have the baseline, but also understanding things need to change when it needs to change and proactively doing it. I think sometimes when people send out their surveys or solicit feedback, I think a huge source of frustration is they do it and then they just kind of disappear. So they're like, a lot of leadership or managers will go be like, yes, we want to hear from you, we want to do those things. So people who are very passionate and invested, and they have that energy, they are interested, they have that buy-in, they give all this feedback and then just stays there. There's no updates, there's no next steps, there's no, well, what now? And so that reoccurring cycle, it just kind of adds to people wanting to leave or not really caring or having that buy-in as much. So I kind of help a lot with like, if you have the feedback, how can we then implement it into an action plan so things keep evolving and addressing things to grow?
That's so important. I totally agree that if leadership goes out and asks people for their opinion and then doesn't act on it or just kind of ignores it, that's just a huge slap in the face to your entire team. And then you wonder why they're not showing up, giving 100%, or why they leave, is because I remember hearing a story during the pandemic, it was like in the pandemic, or when the company was like towards the end when things were starting to open back up, and leadership was asking the team about, you guys want to do like return to office or stay remote or do hybrid? And we want to hear from you, we really care. And the majority of the staff was saying, we'd like a hybrid model. And then the leadership team got all the information, and then like a week later sent out this like report saying everyone back in the office in 2 weeks, and like 95% of their staff quit. Like, oh, you heard what we said and did something we didn't want you to do, because return to office was the least popular item of like option. And so like, if you're gonna say you care and listen, and then you don't actually act on it, or you do what people don't want to do, then you can't be surprised when they leave or stop.
Everyone always acts surprised. And I was like, I wish people, like, if you're going to just do it anyways, just do it. Just own it. I would respect, like, things so much more if they're just like, we're just going to do it and just not care. It was like, great, but don't be surprised when people choose to leave or go on to something more aligned. So
yeah, it's baffling to me the lack of kind of situational awareness, or surprised at the repercussions of when you don't treat your team, the people that make up the company, that make your company exist and do all the work, if you don't treat them with respect and show you actually care about them as people, and then you wonder why they're not showing up or not delivering the results you need to make your company successful, I got see how people don't understand the connection between those two, and that the if you're gonna grow your business or you're gonna implement changes to a process or something, you have to get your people on board, because they're gonna be the ones who actually make it happen and do all the work.
Yeah, I will also add another element of like, because I was sitting there wondering, like, it doesn't make sense, but sometimes you're just you have to know, like, who are you surrounded by? A lot of times in leadership positions, because of power dynamics, you're surrounded by people who have that fear of retaliation or getting fired, and they're just going to say yes and like, yeah, that works, or yeah, that makes sense. Like, there's no openness or of communication, like pushing back. So there's almost a lack of accountability or consequence of just like when leadership or someone has this idea and no one's like, are you sure, or does that make sense? And they're just like, yes, it will. And it's like, well, if you do, this is all the other things that happen. So I'm someone that's like very mindful. It's baffling, but it also makes sense when if you look at your surroundings and everyone's just agreeing with you, or they are someone that has the same mindset of you. So I'm always someone that's a huge advocate of always kind of going back to connecting, like kind of going to people and talking to folks with outside of your lived experience and having different perspectives, and kind of having those spaces to kind of be like, what can we actually do? Obviously with a baseline of respect and things like that, but it's okay to disagree. It's okay to get other perspectives and just be like, okay, not everything has to be about you and your opinion, because if that was the case, you wouldn't have a team or employees or scaling or things like that. Like, there's some people who might be more innovative or have a different perspective of you more than you realize, and you would never know because you laid them off or they left already.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of bringing in a consultant, someone from outside who doesn't have the same stake in, like, because if like they can give you that fresh perspective on what really is going on and point out these problems that leadership is either blind to or kind of ignoring or trying, or like wishing away. But having someone, and I know it's difficult to have flaws or problems pointed out, but if you're going to grow a business, you got to address these problems. You can't just wish them away. You got to put in the hard work, and you got to, especially these days, if you're going to stand out and be successful, you have to build these relationships, and you have to learn how to listen to people. And so having someone from outside your team who isn't just a yes man sort of thing come in and really be able to point out the areas that need to be fixed, and is able to start fostering this communication and the relationships with your team, I think is worth the investment 10 times over, because of the impact it's going to have if you actually follow through with what they suggest.
Yes, heavy on the follow through with the suggestions. I remember I was working with a company and I kind of just saw everything, and I gave like tidbits and things like that. And I just kind of suggested maybe the CEO should take a sabbatical for a little bit and just kind of reset. Because I think also, like, being a leader is not easy. It is overwhelming to have those things. So after a while, it is okay to just kind of be like, you know what? I hired the right people. I trust them to be able to do the things. I need to take a step back and really like reset and make sure I'm good. So I was like, sometimes it's okay to just take a rest and trust the people that you hired, because they're hired for a reason.
Yeah, I think that's also a big thing, is giving people, trusting your team to do what you hired them to do, and to be the right people for the job. I think so. I'd love to hear kind of what some of the results you've seen companies experience when they actually implement and follow these suggestions that you've been talking about. What are some of the results you've seen?
Oh, just high levels. I've seen people actually smile at work uh, for little things and actually enjoy showing up to work. But even more from a business standpoint, I see the customers just getting more like positive reviews of those results, because if their employees are happy, the customers tend to be happy. Also, just retention elevated, more money, profits. Obviously, I didn't know like the full details, but I did hear through like the grapevine that like profits did elevate. So I think like just actually investing in your people, investing in like connection and those type of things lead to like, if the internal is good, then externally customers are happy, they'll spend more, there's more retention that way. But I think because it's not the immediate results, it takes time. And I think that's something that people, they want, when they think of something, they want it yesterday.
Yeah, I think, and it just, that's not how relationship building works. And so if you keep trying to cut these corners to get the result you want, you end up, you don't get what you want because you're not building the relationships the way that humans really build relationships. And that does take time because we're still using the same operating system we have for the last several 100,000 years. We can't speed up our brains any faster. We can't build trust any faster. We need to actually, if you actually want to speed up your growth, actually have to slow down and get to connect with people. And that's something that seems so antithetical to most like entrepreneurs or business owners, is like they think they have to go faster. But the key now to speeding up is actually slowing down.
Yeah, I would add, like, yeah, it's definitely work smarter, not harder. And also, I realized if there's like one small bump in the road, they're like, we have to throw everything away and recount. And I was like, no, you can recalibrate. Like, even when you have a product, like if there's one little mistake, you just don't throw the whole product out. You take the time to be understanding, like, okay, why doesn't this work? What are some solutions? It's the same with like relationship building and connecting of like, okay, we had this plan. It seems not to really work out. What are some of the reasons why, and what are some solutions we could do to kind of pivot and make sure we can kind of adapt? Because, you know, humans are fascinating creatures. We're great, but we need to learn how to adapt, and we can't do it while what you're saying of like speeding down the racetrack. We will know better how to recalibrate when we slow down and actually think about it.
Yeah. So what are some things like a leader can do, or like a middle manager and like the employees can do at a company if they're trying to address the cultural debt and improve the relationships in the business in order to improve the bottom line that the leadership cares so much about?
I would say for leadership, just kind of setting that standards, but also that clarity and updates of just being like an open to feedback, just being like, hey, this is what we want to do. If they solicit feedback, actually utilize it, and kind of being firm in that. And also setting up resources to support their managers and just having that clarity and really having them make sure they feel seen. I feel like a lot of times managers don't get all the resources and the clarity. And so they're kind of stuck between, you know, wanting to help their employees, but also looking at leadership, being like, what are you talking about? So having that, maybe those like, you know, professional development is helpful. Having those people trained and supported to kind of help navigate those things. That's something leadership could do. As managers, kind of making sure they take care of themselves. A lot of managers sometimes are really good as ICs, individual contributors, for those that don't know, but really good at that. But managing people is a whole other skill set within itself. So not having that ego, not realizing, you know, it's not really about you all the time. Sometimes it's just everything around you, and help navigate those things. So I think something managers and up could just remember to be kind to themselves, because they themselves are people too. And understanding of like, okay, take a breath, what makes sense, and no, feedback is not an attack. It's because people are invested in caring and want to see everyone win. Also with employees, the same thing. I will acknowledge the societal privileges and power dynamics of everything. So my suggestions for employees, for, you know, like I'm a Black woman, so something I suggest for me or you, it might look different, and just kind of acknowledging our lived experiences. So something for me or someone that identified with me or someone similar with my lived experiences, I always suggest like boundaries are lovely. Also understanding that I tell people I'm a recovering perfectionist and with heavy people pleaser. So someone just like having boundaries is not an attack. I can still care. I can still do my work, but I can't pour from an empty cup, and kind of realizing those things. Some with other more societal privilege, kind of making space for other voices that aren't always heard and supported, and kind of taking that chance. I think people so much are, and it is a thing of perfectionism, because I've done it too, is of making a mistake, but you don't know until you at least try. And just know that, like, not to be malicious, and it is very vulnerable. Vulnerable is a superpower, I think, of just being like, I may make a mistake, but I'm at least going to open myself to learning and trying and navigating those things. And I think that employees and managers and everyone can kind of learn that, because outside of these power dynamics and roles, like, we are humans at the end of the day, just trying to figure everything out. I know I mentioned to you before of like, focus things out within your sphere of control, because there's so many chaotic things happening around us. And I think once we kind of ground ourselves, I like to ground myself in joy and gratitude, and just kind of take a breath and just kind of be present as much as possible. I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I really appreciate you sharing those tips for the different people inside a community or inside a company. It should be a community if you're doing it right. And I acknowledge that.
Changeable. That's why I do both.
Yeah, and it makes sense that for individual employees, the best steps to take are going to be different. And I think that it is important that people, like you mentioned, be agile and willing to adapt and pivot, and don't expect it to be perfect the first time you do it, and that there will be mistakes. But again, if you stick to open communication and honesty and being vulnerable, then you will build those relationships, and it will be better off for the business's bottom line, because you're building human connections within your team. And like, as you said earlier, when your team is thriving and supported, that turns into better experiences for your customers and your clients. And that leads to the bottom line that all these leaders are desperately chasing, and trying to skip these steps that are really want. So thank you so much for connecting with me today, Andie. If you enjoyed the episode of the Human Connection podcast, please like, review, and share it on Apple Podcasts. If you're interested in connecting with myself or Andie, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.